Morning, everybody. Good morning to you all, and welcome to another installment of the Tax Policy Center's Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Mark Mazur, the Robert C. Posen Director of the Urban-Brookings Tax Policy Center. And today, we're just delighted to host my good friend and former colleague, Commissioner John Koskinen of the Internal Revenue Service. Before I begin my remarks, I'd like to acknowledge our online audience who are watching today. I'd like to encourage all of you here and online to share your thoughts and observations via social media using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And for online viewers, we encourage you to send in questions and comments by emailing us using the address events@urban.org. And there will be a Q&A portion, so those questions will be helpful then. Today, we're honored to have Commissioner John Koskinen joining us. Commissioner Koskinen was confirmed as the 48th IRS Commissioner in December 2013. And so he served in this role as IRS Commissioner for nearly 4 years, which is about 28 dog years. And Commissioner Koskinen, he has an extraordinary background. He earned a bachelor's degree from Duke, a law degree from Yale. He has a distinguished career. I'm just going to give you a few highlights of this. He clerked for Chief Judge Bazelon of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. He served on the Kerner Commission. He was a legislative assistant to New York City Mayor John Lindsay, and an aide to Senator Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut. He worked for the Palmieri Company, where he rose to become president and CEO. But as part of that experience, he worked on turning around troubled organizations like Penn Central Railroad, Mutual Benefit Life Insurance Company, and the Teamsters Pension Fund. John Koskinen served as Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget in the Clinton administration, and he chaired the Clinton administration's Y2K efforts. He served as Deputy Mayor and City Administrator for the District of Columbia. He's been on the Duke University Board of Trustees, also President of U.S. Soccer Foundation, served as Chairman of Freddie Mac and its Chief Executive Officer, and are probably like things I've forgotten, but it's quite an impressive set of accomplishments. And then from there, took on the role of Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, one of the things that I think is perhaps the most difficult job in all of government. As the Commissioner's term comes to an end, we're lucky to have Commissioner Koskinen here for a chunk of time this morning. I'm going to have a pleasant conversation with him on stage, and then we'll have time to take your questions. Again, please follow us using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And now please join me in welcoming Commissioner John Koskinen to the stage.
In the back hear me?
Here it is.
Oh,
it is working.
Okay. Speak and they give you a voice.
It's pretty amazing being here at Urban. They have the technology to allow you to do all this.
Terrific. It doesn't work this way at the IRS, I can assure you that.
So you were at the IRS for nearly 4 years. Does it seem like it's been that long, or has time just flown by for you?
As the famous Chinese curse, may you live in interesting time. It's been an interesting 4 years. It actually has gone very fast, notwithstanding all the trials and tribulations and the challenges we've had. And as I near the end, it goes even faster and faster. So it's been, you would think that if you weren't enjoying it, it would take forever. But the dog has survived well, the 28 years.
And so I mentioned a little bit that you've worked with distressed firms in the past, Penn Central, Freddie Mac. Did any of those experiences prepare you for kind of a turnaround job at the Internal Revenue Service?
Well, to some extent in my checkered employment career, they've all been organizations under stress where you don't have a lot of time to do consultant studies and take 6 months to figure out what you're going to do. There are challenges you have to meet immediately. But as I've told IRS employees, but you all haven't heard it all at the same time, the thing I learned early on was if you want to know what's going on in an organization, go out and talk to the people actually doing the work. And they have the best line of sight of what's happening and oftentimes give you pretty good indications of what the problems are. And so I've always, I learned that the easy way, we would come in not as consultants, but kind of parachute in as the new CEO, CFO, senior management. So there weren't any former senior executives to talk to. So by definition, you ended up talking to people doing the work. And I was always struck by, especially when we did Levitt & Sons, which had been bought by IT&T, and did it under an antitrust consent decree. And I discovered that when you went out and talked to people, oftentimes nobody had ever asked them before what they thought of what was going on, or if anybody had talked to them, oftentimes they never listened to them. So my strategy when I started at the IRS, at my confirmation hearing, I was asked, what are your plans for the IRS, as if I was coming in with a whole new set of ideas. And I responded, I said I'd already had a series of about 25 briefings with everybody running anything at the IRS. And listening to them, you could figure out exactly what the challenges were in each of the operating divisions and figure out where the priorities were as you went forward. So I have continued on. I went to 2 cities a week for 3.5 months doing town halls at the major IRS facilities and have ended up talking to over 20,000 IRS employees in the course of the 4 years as an important way to figure out not only at the start what their concerns were and what their thoughts were, but people have asked me, well, don't you at some point, done over 80 town halls, hear the same thing? And I said, no, I've never, literally, had a frontline managers or frontline employee town hall without learning something new, either an issue that we hadn't heard before or something that I thought had been solved and still was out there as a problem. So I do it not just to show the flag for employees, I do it because it has been the most important and effective way to keep an eye on and finger on the pulse of what actually is happening.
And so when I was at the Energy Department, I worked at the Energy Information Administration as acting administrator. My predecessor, Jay Hakes, there did something he called a work day. He would go out to various parts of the organization and actually spend a day or half a day doing that job. And I guess he had gotten it from Governor Graham of Florida, kind of doing that kind of a thing. I thought it was a very valuable thing to do, to actually go and like answer the telephones for a day. And see what kind of questions people were calling in with, or work with folks doing forecasting to try and develop a better forecast for oil prices. Do you have similar experience?
Well, funny you should ask. Okay. The first town hall I did was in Cincinnati in January of 2014, because that was the epicenter of the C4 social welfare argument, and were we targeting them or not. And I thought it was important to go to those employees and let them know we hadn't forgotten about them and that I understood the stress they were under and was supportive. And I was, as I've told people, amazed and delighted that when I got there, I found instead of a disgruntled set of people concerned and personally, a set of people energetic and dedicated to the mission and concerned about the lack of resources in interfering with our ability to get the job done, whether it was taxpayer service or enforcement. So I did spend part of the time, and I sat with an employee who was on the phone with a taxpayer, and he was running at a computer, and it was running a case management system called the TED system. And as he sat there, he called up the first page, and the page came up really very slowly, like a 1995 modem dial-up. So then he talked to the taxpayer, and then he needed the next page, and it came up very slowly. And I thought, wow, if you think of the number of employees we got using this system, waiting for the pages to come up very slowly, we are, wasting a lot of time. So I always bounded back to Washington with new ideas. So I came back and I said, we got to do something to fix the TED system. I ultimately discovered we have 62 separate case management systems, a number of which have pages that come up very slowly. So the result of that is we're halfway through, 3/4 of the way through a major initiative to consolidate all those into one enterprise case management system, which not only will have pages come up pretty quickly, but for taxpayers will allow them for the first time when they call to talk to somebody, whoever they talk with who's authorized, will now have their case in one system, so they'll be able to talk to them about everything that's happened to the taxpayer, when they filed, what letters they got, what their responses were. Now when you call, if you've got 2 or 3 different issues, you end up having to be referred to 2 or 3 different people with those 2 or 3 different case management systems. So ironically, the first place I visited ended up raising an issue that is going to be a sea change whenever it gets done for taxpayers and for employees.
So lesson for all the managers or would-be managers out there.
Right. No, I can't gainsay the importance of trying to, especially in a large organization, even with our shrunken resources down 20,000, we still have 80,000 people, and that's a lot of people all around the country. And so I always tell people that when you read about large organizations that have problems, a lot of times those problems got stuck somewhere in the middle, and nobody at the top ever knew about them, and that's why they got to be harder to solve.
No, it's one of the things that I think I found when I was at the Internal Revenue Service is that people try to fix the problems themselves, and they tend not to really want to raise issues to higher levels unless you go ask. And I'd almost think that people would go along and they say, well, I could fix this, and then maybe my coworkers can help me fix this, and then maybe a miracle will happen, it'll go away, and then now let me raise it to the higher-ups on this. And you have to counteract that actively.
Exactly. We set up an enterprise case management, I'm sorry, a risk management organization with a chief risk officer when I started. And it's designed to deal with just that. What I'm trying to get the employees to understand is that bad news is good news, and the only problem we can't solve is the problem we don't know about. And every employee has to view themselves as a risk manager. That we're going to make mistakes. We have 80,000 employees. We processed this year 152 million individual tax returns. We've got the world's most complicated tax code. So to maintain we're going to have a system that never has a problem is illusory and silly. The better goal, and I said this at my confirmation hearing, is to say if we make a mistake, have a problem, we'll find it quickly, we'll fix it quickly, and we'll be transparent about it. And so your point's exactly right. Employees sometimes are worried if I raise my hand and say somebody made a mistake, we'll all get fired or get yelled at. Mid-level managers think, well, it's my job as a manager to solve this problem. And so you read these stories, the General Motors ignition switch problem, Volkswagen diesels, anything, Wells Fargo, and even the IRS with the C4 issue. And people at the top say they didn't know, and they're not lying, they probably didn't know, and that's the problem. The question is, how do you get a system comfortable that if there is bad news, if there is a problem, that the right solution to it is to have, as I say, everybody work on it together. I tell employees if somebody makes a mistake, it's my mistake, and we'll fix it. If there's a problem somewhere and we're going to have them, it's my problem, and we'll work on it together. What can't work is for it to be stuck somewhere in the middle. As I say, problems don't get better with age. Usually they get just worse and more complicated. And so it is, so in my town halls now I ask frontline employees, how many of you think of yourselves as a risk manager? And I don't necessarily yet get a lot of raised hands. So we're trying to figure out, is there a better terminology? Although when we got done with it all, we thought we'd spent so much time talking about individuals being risk managers that we should stick with it. And as I tell the employees, the marketers always say you have to make 7 impressions before anybody understands or hears the message. And you sometimes feel uneasy about telling people the same thing 7 times, but I've decided, okay, I continue to say, and I'm going to say it at the end, everybody needs to be a risk manager, because you're exactly right. That's the only way, particularly large organizations, can be nimble and quick and responsive to whatever's happening on the front lines.
And so when I was at the IRS, I found the staff like incredibly dedicated and proud of the work they do. But you see a lot of criticism coming from officials, elected officials, and even some of the public. How do you keep the staff focused on day-to-day work and try to make them less aware of the ongoing criticisms?
Well, it's a challenge, but it is a great workforce. I have said I've got 45 years of running all of these crazy organizations, and I've never dealt with a better workforce. They really continue to be amazingly enthusiastic and dedicated. So my rule at the front end was that if there was going to be a hearing or there's going to be a testimony or a speech someplace, particularly on the hearings, you got the IRS commissioner. You didn't get everybody else is a career employee except the chief counsel.
Which is something people don't really know, right? You have 80,000 people and 2 political appointees. 2 political
appointees and only 1 running the place. The chief counsel has a couple thousand lawyers, very big law firm, but the bulk of the 80,000 people report to 1 political appointee. So it's an organization run by career people, and as a result, I think it's part of the reason they're so dedicated to the mission is they understand that they really are totally responsible. As I used to kid when I started, you know, the place is designed to run no matter who the idiot is, they appoint as commissioner, and so I kind of filled that role. So my the Koskinen rule was, okay, if you're going to hold a hearing, you get the commissioner. And then there was some question on the Hill about that, so I told our legislative people, I said, whatever the issue is, the response is the commissioner is concerned about it, has spent a lot of time studying it, and is the best person to talk about it. I don't care what the issue is. So for a couple of years that worked well, and I got yelled at and grenades thrown at me, and ultimately people trying to impeach me. And then at some point along the way, particularly the House Oversight Committee, got tired of my fencing with them and the fact that I don't push well. So they then insisted that they didn't want the commissioner. They insisted they wanted a career person. So I said, well, you know, I'll bring them along with me, and I did that on 2 or 3 occasions if you want, but I'm the one you should be yelling at. So then the chairman and I had a discussion. He said, well, I'll just, you know, I want them. And I said, you can't have them. And he said, well, we'll subpoena them. I said, that's the only way you'll get them. So for a couple of hearings, they subpoenaed career people to come up. And then at some point, I thought, well, this is kind of silly. But I think the employees understood that if somebody was going to take the heat, the commissioner was the right person. And that's part of my job description.
Let's switch topics a little bit. You headed
Why
up,
not?
You headed up the Y2K changeover, the switch to January 1st, 2000 during the Clinton administration. And I was at the Energy Department at the time, and I remember that changeover well. Did you get any lessons from that you could apply to IRS IT upgrades?
We did not plan these questions. These are his questions, but funny you should ask. The way we did Y2K was we took, we created a President's Council on Year 2000 Conversion, which had people from across every agency represented, including the regulatory agencies, the SEC, the Federal Reserve Board. And then we looked at the infrastructure and decided what was at risk of failing and would be a problem. And it turned out we ended up with 25 different parts of the critical infrastructure, everything from state and local government to power, telecommunication, the obvious things, healthcare, higher education. And so we took each member of the President's Council and put them in charge of whatever looked relevant. So the Energy Department, the Deputy Secretary was in charge of energy, gas, oil and gas. And then we formed working groups on the theory that what we ought to do is energize and organize, or take industry groups that were organized and have them work together with us. And needless to say, it was a little hard to convince the private sector people that we were from the government and we were really going to cooperate with them and collaborate and try to help them. So the first meetings we'd have, the first half hour was people spending time trying to figure out if we were really serious about this. And then in the case of oil and gas, they spent the next half hour with the oil industry here and the gas industry there trying to figure out, can we really talk to each other? So the net result was we had the entire critical infrastructure organized. Sometimes the Washington organizations, when I would talk to the American Petroleum Institute, would say, well, we don't do that. You know, we provide information. And I said, well, if your industry goes down, it's not going to be good, and you're the best people to do it. So we ended up with this partnership where we didn't tell anybody what to do, but we got everybody organized to try to deal with it. And then we got the Congress to, I told them in the summer of '98, if you could do one thing to solve the problem, you would pass liability limiting legislation that would allow people in an industry to share information without violating the antitrust laws and without getting sued if the information they provided turned out not to be right. You can imagine what it's like by unanimous consent to get the House and the Senate to agree to liability limiting legislation, but we managed to pull it off, and that was the key, because now all of these companies could talk to each other and share information, and then we ended up doing it around the world. So we had continental Y2K organizing. And the net result was that you know, I got a lot of pushback from the Congress. So when I had my first hearing, they said, how many people have you got? And I had a deputy and a press person and an assistant. I thought that would show I was frugal. The headline was, administration not serious, how could you do it with 4 people? So we ended up with 13 people, in effect organizing the world to respond, because the goal was to leverage all the expertise and the experience of the people who knew what they were talking about. And even in terms of contingency planning, there was an idea where somehow we should pull together 1,300 or 1,500 IT experts and we'd fix the problems. And I remember Dick Clark, who was the National Security Council guy, and I were talking, and Dick and I were the only ones who thought this would be a great test of how to protect the infrastructure as a lesson. But even Dick, who was a kind of a command and control guy, said, well, you know, we've got all these certs and we'll pull them all together. And I said, we can't get enough people to know how to fix a power plant and how to fix a transportation system, we need to organize, take all of these people and turn them into help desks. So everybody, New Year's Eve, we had help desks all around the country, industry by industry, as we went forward. So the idea that we could tell them what to do or mandate it, it seemed to me didn't make much sense. And the idea that we were going to provide a lot of resources to do it didn't make much sense. So that's what we've done really with the best example. Bill Hoffman's back there. Poor Bill's heard this 88 times, 5 minutes to go. Is the best example is what we've done with identity theft and refund fraud. 2.5 years ago, as the states were starting to get attacked, we called together the CEOs. I invited the CEOs of H&R Block, Intuit for TurboTax, the software developers, all the state tax commissioners, several financial institutions, to come to Washington. And as I told them, much what I did with Y2K, said the purpose of this meeting isn't to tell you what to do. The purpose of this meeting is we've got to form a partnership to get the entire tax ecosystem together, ecosystem together to solve this problem. None of us by ourselves can do it. Actually, Bill Cobb, then the CEO of H&R Block, said, well, you have to set standards for us. And I said, well, I'm happy to set the standards. You just have to tell me what they are that work. Because they were concerned if it got harder to use H&R Block or TurboTax software, or somebody down the street would say, hey, you know, you don't have to identify yourself with all those complications. Come with us. So we did all that, and the question from the press was, well, okay, you got all this stuff going. What difference is it going to make? And I wasn't sure what difference it would make, but it couldn't make it worse. At the end of the first year, the number of people identifying themselves as victims of identity theft went down by 47%. This is after 6 or 8 years in which we thought we were doing well if we held our own. So then the question was, for last filing season, was, gee, that was great, but are you going to bounce back up? How do you maintain that? The number for last year went down by over 40% on top of that. So it means in 2 years, this partnership, with a lot of phenomenal work done by IRS employees and the return review program that keeps getting attacked in Congress, have cut the number of victims of identity theft by 2/3. Last filing season, over 400,000 taxpayers would have been victims of identity theft without that partnership and the work they did.
That's quite an accomplishment. Reading your bio, you're a major sports fan, particularly the Duke Blue Devils. And I'm looking forward personally to the upcoming college basketball season. Being an alum of Michigan State, get to see them maybe in the Blue Devils go at it for the NCAA championship. So it should be a good year. Did you play any organized sports when you were younger?
I was a football player and a tennis player, odd combination. In high school, I played actually, walked on at Duke for about a week. In those days, Duke went to the Orange Bowl that year and the Cotton Bowl my senior year, so everybody was a lot bigger than I was. So I was a physics major, so I thought maybe I should go to class and beg it. But yeah, so I've been a sports junkie from the time I was a kid.
Are there any lessons from sports that you take into the management role you've had?
Well, you know, football is, everybody's worried about concussions and the rest of it, and having had a couple, maybe that explains some of my problems. But you develop a lot of self-confidence. You're competing against other people, and so it was a way, you know, I thought for a young kid in junior high school and high school to feel more self-confident that, you know, I could play my role. And it is a teamwork game, football. I mean, it's all got to work together. And you have a team of 30, 40, 50 people, and you're all in that battle together. And so I think that competitiveness, the self-confidence that comes from it. I was also a high school and college debater, and so that's part of the reason I enjoy fencing with people at hearings. All of that turned out to be a useful experience.
So one more question before we open it up to the audience. What are the major misconceptions that you think the public has about the IRS?
The major, I think, problem, the misconception is people don't understand how much we care about taxpayers and taxpayer service, that our real goal in life is to have people be compliant. And I've always said, if you're trying to be compliant and you have a problem, you don't have to call somebody off late night TV to contact us. We want to work with you to get you to be compliant. We have online installment agreements. We have offers in compromise. The people we chase, and we deserve to have a reputation that scares you a little, if you consciously are cheating, as I've said, I'm happy to chase you to the end of the earth. Because the system has got to be fair, and you're cheating other people if you're cheating on your taxes. But I've said that we really, thousands of our employees are spending their time trying to help taxpayers figure out what they owe and how to pay it. So while I've kidded along the way that it may take me a while to say we're from the IRS and we're here to help you, I do think it's important for the public to understand that a significant part of our effort is designed simply to try to make it as easy as possible, as understandable as possible for people. What do they owe and how they pay it? And to the extent we can be helpful, our call center people, thousands of people on the phone, view it and they love their jobs because they feel they're helping people on the phone.
Okay. Let's open it up to questions from the audience.
Wow.
I'm sure we have a few.
Ready.
You want to choose?
I want to choose. Okay.
You choose first.
Nice.
Oh, could you identify yourself, please?
Jan Holtzblatt.
Oh, and a
There's even
microphone.
a
Oh,
mic.
mic
This is really a fancy place.
Hello.
We spare no
Um,
expense for you.
Yes, it is. Janet Holtzblatt, Congressional Budget Office. Before your time at IRS, I was at Treasury and I worked with IRS very closely. And I would come over there and with a brilliant idea. Some of it were actually implemented, but I'd come over there and so often I would be told, Janet, money. It takes money. At that time, your budget was pretty good.
Right.
Ain't so good now. You've talked about some of the initiatives of the enterprise systems, for example. When you do something like that, where does the money come from in these days of declining resources?
It's a good challenge. We're down $900 million over since 2010, even though we've got 10 million more taxpayers and a lot of challenges. In fact, my concern as I'm making my farewell tour on the Hill is down 20,000 employees. At some point, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when this system fails. Our IT system is antiquated, and one of these days it's not going to be able to process the filing season. And as our audit rate drops by over 50%, at some point the compliance rate is going to decline. But in the meantime, when I started, I said, if we just guerrilla warfight our way through this budget problem, we'll wake up 4 to 5 years down the road and be just 4 to 5 years farther ahead. So we've got to become as efficient as we can, but we have to cobble together the resources wherever we can to get more information to people online, to be able to get people to have an online account, to be able to do things like attack refund fraud by continuing to develop our filters. We have over 200 filters that now look for anomalies. So it's a constant battle, and I get yelled at depending on what somebody thinks on the Hill we should have done more of. But the way we deal with that, I've turned the entire senior executive team, about 40 executives, the people running anything and their deputies across the entire agency, into, in effect, the budget group. And we take all the initiatives that are out there that people have, everybody gets to make a presentation, and at the end everybody votes. Everybody gets 100 chips as a way of setting the priorities as to where the funding needs to go. So it does mean we don't do as much about IT development as we'd like. We don't do quite as much about taxpayer service as we like. We don't do as much taxpayer enforcement as we like, because if we do everything we want in one area, the rest of the place is just going to fall apart. So it's a constant battle to try to figure out how to even things out. So the net result is we didn't have enough people anywhere when I started, and we're another 15,000 people behind. We have areas that are down 30%. So, but I continue to believe, and the system believes, that if we don't keep moving forward, you're going to fall significantly farther back. Okay, in the far back. But he needs a microphone. How many microphones do we have? Wow, very impressive.
Steve Rosenthal here at Tax Policy Center. First, I want to thank you for your public service, which has been truly outstanding. And my question is, how have you been able to keep the IRS and its mission moving forward at a time that you've taken a lot of incoming flack? What tips can you offer to institutions that try to keep their eye on the ball and move forward?
Well, that's by advice. You can get distracted if you take it all personally. You know, I've been yelled at a lot. They tried to impeach me, tried to get me fired. And, you know, you can start getting ground down by it, or you can get distracted by it. And it goes to Mark's point about, I think one way you keep morale up, goes to the question from the CBO, morale up is to keep focusing on what our mission is and that we're making progress moving forward. And I think if people feel and can see that notwithstanding everything else going on, we actually are making progress, it helps them keep focused, keeps their enthusiasm, their morale up. But you know, it's pretty easy to understand how people get distracted You know, I get cards, I get letters, I get you know, a lot of inquiries from the Hill, complaints about one thing or the other. We have an active IG. I'm a big supporter of IGs because it goes back to the earlier discussion. I tell people the IG doesn't create the problem. They just find it for you before it gets worse. And sometimes you get a little carried away with their reports, but they're important reports to have. So you just have to keep focused on where you're going, and it does start from the top. If I look like I'm frazzled or going under or not paying attention to everything, then everybody else will start to get worried about it, and you know, and the place will sort of stagnate.
Okay.
All right.
I got a question from the web. Let me.
From the web. Ah, hide out there.
This is Brody writing and saying that confidential information is constantly threatened by cyber attacks, and the nature of these attacks is always evolving. What is the IRS doing to respond to these evolving threats to protect taxpayer information? And would consolidating all tax information in one case management system actually expose taxpayers to greater risk?
It's a good question. While we've had criminals, and we're dealing with organized crime syndicates around the world who've gotten to be very adept at impersonating taxpayers, no one's been able to actually breach the system. So we've had people get erroneously tax transcripts primarily, masquerading as a taxpayer, but they have not been able to get into the system. So with our limited resources, we spend a significant amount of time obviously worried about security. We get attacked. I was originally told we got attacked 1 million times a day or probed, and I said, I can't say that. That's a number that's, you know, unfathomable. It's now up to 4 million, at which point I say, well, I could say 1 million then because it's very conservative. We really are dealing with all those people you read about who are hacking into systems, trying to affect elections, et cetera. They're all out there because we've got the world's greatest database. So it is a high priority. But you know, one of the issues in Equifax was they didn't put on the right patch. We have such a huge system. We have thousands of patches that keep showing up every day, and it's a prioritization. We can't do them all because we don't have the resources. But we are doing that. We now have created, creating things, another partnership internally. We have an executive steering committee worried about authentication and identification and cybersecurity. And I've done that so that everybody across the agency knows exactly what's going on, whether it's criminal investigation, IT, our wage and investment group, because we've got to be able to continue. After we had a problem with our Get Transcript system 2.5 years ago, I said we need to look at every way anybody gets information or money out of the system or provides us information or money. There are 277 touch points. I thought there might be 30 or 40. And we are investigating all of those, again, prioritizing which ones to protect. Now our problem is as we get better and more secure, the next thing with the security summit that we created 2.5 years ago we're focused on is what are all of these criminals doing one step removed. So they're actually out trying to steal information from tax preparers. They are actually trying to masquerade as CEOs and get W-2s and information out of companies. So if they can't get the data from us, our concern is we've got to now work with everybody out there to warn them about what the scams are, what the risks are, because the goal of these criminals is to make themselves look exactly like you so that the 200 filters and the anomalies we have don't catch them.
Okay, another question? You want to choose one?
Front row. Oh, what's the fun of being in the front row if you don't get to ask a question? This is designed actually to give the microphone holders a lot of exercise.
Thank you, Commissioner. Floyd Williams with Public Strategies Washington and formerly IRS and Treasury. And I want to thank you for your admirable service, too. I think you came in at a difficult time, and you're going out standing tall. Which leads to my question. If it was your choice, what attributes would you look for in your successor?
Actually, I've talked to the Treasury Secretary about that, who is a good guy and very supportive of the IRS and understands the issues. From the time of his confirmation hearing, is urged that there be appropriate resources provided to the agency. He said he was surprised at how under-resourced we were. The restructuring commission 20 years ago, as you know, basically said the IRS commissioner first ought to have a 5-year term so that it doesn't just turn around in 2 or 3 years. The commissioner makes a commitment to be there a while. And also the 5 years means it's not a coterminous appointment with the change of administration, to make it as clear as you could that it should be a non-political appointee. And then the third thing they said was it should be somebody with a management background. And as I've stressed, the IRS had wonderful commissioners who were tax attorneys, tax accountants, people who understood the tax law. and they did a great job. But what the Commission recognized was this is a very big operation. The code gets more and more complicated by the year, and so therefore you need somebody, as I told the Secretary, who thinks managing 80,000 people is fun, that it's a good way to spend your time and are energized by it. And I said, if you know a little about the tax law, it couldn't hurt. You know, I'm a lawyer by training, and I took general tax, corporate tax in law school, et cetera. But as we talked, I said, but if you really wanted to know anything about anything, you ought to know something about information technology, because IT is so central to what we're doing and where we're going. So if I had the perfect candidate, I'd say it was somebody who had managed a large organization or set of them very well, like management, and somebody who understood how to manage and deal with IT, not to be an IT expert, but IT projects have been failing in the private sector and government for a long time, and there are a set of reasons. We dealt with that when I was at OMB that are relatively knowable, but you have to, you know, in other words, they can't be viewed as IT projects. They're business projects. IT is a facilitator. So you need to be comfortable with that if you can. All right, in the far back, where's my,
Where are you going?
on the wall, okay. Okay, at this point, wherever you're near somebody, hand them the microphone.
Not going to get much exercise this way. Hi, John.
Oh, it's
Kent
Kent Watkins. I've got to get my glasses.
National Academy of Housing and Communities. You are probably more of an influencer in housing policy than the Secretary of HUD, in my opinion, because of your management of the tax credit programs, particularly low-income housing. Would you like to comment on any how you're able to do this and be so relatively scandal-free, and what kinds of fail-safe legacies are you going to leave to make sure that continues?
Well, it's a good question across the board. Tax credits, you know, increasingly the irony is with all the grumbling and complaining about the IRS over time, if there's a new program, it usually turns out to be a tax credit administered by the IRS. We run the Earned Income Tax Credit Program. We're one of the world's biggest anti-poverty programs. We have 27, 28 million recipients, and they get $65, $67 billion a year. Now, it all sounds good, and the reason they do that is because people, A, have confidence, notwithstanding the background noise, the IRS will deliver, which we continue to do. And they also do it because it's a straightforward way to, in fact, provide people funding or support, whether it's housing credits or otherwise. The challenge is that they are susceptible then to, and Kent's point's a good one, to fraudulent attempts. If you can, in effect, meet the criteria and get a refund or a check from the IRS, that's better than robbing a bank. So what you get is we spend in all of these credit programs a significant amount of time trying to figure out how to protect them, how to audit them, how to make sure the right amount goes to the right people. As Kent said, the tax credit program has itself an infrastructure that helps in that regard because we're dealing with institutions, with organizations, with companies. The individual tax credits are much more difficult. So the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is very complicated, has an improper payment rate of over 20%. Doesn't mean that it's going to criminals. It just means taxpayers and their preparers have a lot of trouble figuring out what the right amount is and who ought to get it. So I always cringe a little in the tax reform going on now when everybody says, well, we got a new way to deal with this problem, we'll make a credit out of it. I think, well, now that sounds good and the overhead will be low, but it's going to be a major problem to make sure that the right amount goes to the right people.
Okay. I have one last question. Way in the back corner here. Look at the tall guy.
Len Berman, Tax Policy Center. Aside from simplifying the law, getting rid of tax expenditures, are there other things that Congress could do that could make it easier for the IRS to do their job? Actually, I have one suggestion, which is to require everyone who files a 1040 to file electronically. But it seems like there are lots of other things you could do.
Well, as I always explain, Mark has heard me say this before, is we don't have a dog in the fight about tax policy. We do tax administration. I always tell people, you want to blow the whole thing up, whatever you want to do is fine. We have a great interest in how you define it and write the law. And you can take a good idea and write it one way and it's just unenforceable and the taxpayers can't figure it out, or you can write that same policy in another way and it's fairly clear and fairly easy to administer. So I keep reminding everybody as they're doing tax reform right now on the Hill and the administration that we have a lot of people who are very good at tax administration, implementation, execution, and my hope is that they will be at the table helping people draft. That's the way we have people been around long enough. There were in the '86 tax reform. The people dealing with it were around the table were people from the Hill, people from the administration, and people from the IRS. The IRS there to help on the implementation execution. So we've provided, I asked people last summer, I said, well, if they're going to be at it, we ought to go through and provide information of what would simplify the code, not be a policy change, would simplify it. And so we provided all that. I mean, we have 5 or 6 different definitions of child. There are several educational credits that have overlapping differential requirements. And you look at them and say, how does anybody figure out, an average taxpayer, which one of these applies to me and how does it go? And it's obviously much more difficult to deal with. So my hope is that, and I've told people, A, the code is a mess, so anything you could do to reform it would be in everybody's interest. If you could simplify part of what's out there and make sure that whatever you do is as clear as possible, it'd make life a lot easier for taxpayers and ultimately for us.
Well, I got the signal from the back that we should end, but...
Let everybody who's on the website go back to work.
Exactly.
Yes, okay.
So if everybody just join me in thanking Commissioner Koskinen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks you all for showing up.